There are silences that are absolute, and then there are the silences that are merely waiting. The great palace of Golestan, in the heart of 19th century Tehran, was a labyrinth of waiting silences. They hung heavy beneath the vaulted ceilings, trapped in the elaborate tilework, and clung to the velvet draperies. They were the sound of women holding their breath. It was not the sound of a wedding that haunted these halls. It was the chilling, clinical hush of preparation. Imagine torchlight flickering across a closed mahogany door, a beam of light cutting through thick night air, and behind that door, a sound worse than any scream of physical pain, a dry, rapid whimpering. It was the sound of a young royal, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, finally realizing that the gold and the silks were not a promise of luxury, but a magnificent, beautiful cage. She was a daughter of the Qajar dynasty, a princess by birth, an instrument of state policy by decree. Her wedding night was not an exchange of vows. It was the final, devastating payment in a political transaction. And what she feared, what every woman in the harem whispered about, what made their teacups rattle, was not the man she would marry, but the 6 months of systematic destruction that had to occur before she ever met him. Welcome back to the Gruesome Historians. Tonight, we pull back the veil on the invisible violence perfected by an empire. The intentional, psychological erasure of the Qajar brides. To understand this process, you must first understand the Qajar dynasty. From the late 18th century until 1925, they reigned over Persia, an empire built on shrewd alliances, military might, and the absolute control of resources. And in this economy of power, the royal daughters were not people. They were the highest denomination of political currency. A princess was born not into comfort, but into a transaction. Her body, her fertility, and the legitimacy of her lineage were state assets. When the Shah needed to secure a powerful general's loyalty, cement a truce with a neighboring Khan, or reward a loyal minister with status, he simply signed a contract and gave away his daughter. The girl had no voice, no choice, and, most crucially, no value outside of this function. The system demanded that these women be perfectly compliant instruments. A general's wife, if she retained her own will, could become a subtle, devastating threat to the entire political structure. She might whisper dangerous thoughts to her husband. She might challenge the arrangement. Therefore, her will had to be surgically removed. The goal of the 6 months of preparation wasn't to teach etiquette. It was to erase the girl who knew how to think and replace her with a beautiful, sentient doll designed only for obedience. It was a psychological blueprint for absolute submission, a secret manual of torture that left no bruises. Let us follow the journey of one such daughter. We will call her Parvana, a princess of 15 years, spirited and curious, who loved to study maps and imagine the world beyond the palace walls. Her fate was decided on a warm afternoon in 1862. Her future husband, a provincial governor, twice her age, known for his harsh temper and his immense landholdings. The engagement was announced with fanfare, but for Parvana, her world immediately began to shrink. The first stage of erasure was isolation. Where she once moved freely through the palace gardens, she was now restricted to a few adjoining chambers. Her books of poetry and philosophy were removed. The friendly, casual interactions with eunuchs and female servants, sources of small human connection, were forbidden. She was suddenly surrounded by a new cohort of women, the overseers of brides. They were ancient, emotionless women who moved with the chilling certainty of executioners, their faces set in permanent, judgmental stone. Parvana was now perpetually watched, perpetually judged. Every look, every step, every moment of her day became a test she was implicitly failing. This sudden, acute social isolation, the feeling that every potential ally had been removed, was the first psychological wedge, driving a paralyzing wedge between her mind and the world she knew. She began to hear the silence, waiting for her, and it sounded like a tomb. The Qajar system was brilliant because it attacked the seat of identity, language. Over the first months, Parvana's vocabulary was systematically reduced. She was permitted to speak only in response to direct questions, and her responses were limited to a formal repertoire of approved phrases. Yes, as you wish. Forgive my inadequacy. Thank you for your kindness. Anything outside of this, a spontaneous thought, a question, an expression of fear, was met with swift, devastating social punishment. This wasn't just about manners. Language is the tool we use to maintain a continuous self. When you cannot articulate your confusion, the confusion calcifies inside you. When you cannot express your fear, the fear becomes a silent, internal scream. Parvana couldn't say, "I am terrified. I don't want this." So her brain learned to stop thinking those thoughts. She was trained alongside a few other girls, all potential sources of comfort, yet all positioned against her. A single transgression by one girl, a word spoken out of turn, meant isolation for the transgressor, but also visible disdain from the others, who were warned that her failure jeopardized their preparation. The system weaponized connection, forcing the victims to police each other. Parvana learned the ultimate destructive lesson. Connection is dangerous. Compliance is the only sanctuary. If you're still with me, if the weight of this invisible control is starting to settle on your mind, you understand how deep these dark histories go. If you want more stories like this, stories that empires tried to bury, like this video and subscribe to the Gruesome Historians. That simple action helps us pull back the curtain on the silent suffering that shapes history. Next, they targeted her body. Parvana was subjected to hours of daily movement training, a precise, almost militaristic choreography designed to destroy her physical confidence. Her tutors had once taught her grace. Now they taught her smallness. She practiced the 8 movements of submission, the retreat bow, where she had to back away without ever turning her back, an act that required agonizing, constant failure, the serving bow, where she lowered herself to a position of inherent powerlessness. The angle of her neck, the length of her stride, everything was precisely measured. The goal was to train her body to express subordination at a neurological level. Her muscles had to learn the posture of submission so deeply that her conscious mind didn't even have to command it. If her step was too long or her spine too straight, the tutor would snarl, "Your body is too proud. You are not broken enough." And she would be forced to repeat the motion for an hour. Parvana's body became her enemy, a constant source of shame and failure. She learned the physical grammar of powerlessness. This repeated relentless drilling forces the autonomic nervous system to develop patterns of tension and withdrawal, teaching the body to assume a state of surrendered compliance even when no one is watching. The person who emerges from this training is literally, physically, a smaller, more contained version of their former self. Parallel to the physical training came the testing, a cruel, random process of coercive control. This was presented as preparation for her husband's mercurial nature, but its true function was to install permanent, paralyzing dread. An older overseer would role-play the husband, but not as kind or even rational. She was capricious, cruelly unpredictable, and impossible to satisfy. Parvana would greet her perfectly, perform the required deference, and then, without any justification, the overseer would erupt. "You did that wrong. I saw peasants with more grace. Your husband will cast you aside." Worse still was the silent treatment. The overseer would abruptly stop acknowledging Parvana's existence, speaking around her, talking to other women about her inadequacy as if she were a physically offensive object. This total social erasure, this systematic denial of her very presence, is a form of psychological annihilation. The scenarios were designed to be impossible to pass. Whether Parvana tried harder or remained calm, whether she apologized or accepted criticism, every possible response was deemed a failure. This is the classic technique of learned helplessness. When a victim is placed in a situation where effort is useless and punishment is random, their brain learns that they cannot control their environment. They stop trying. They stop fighting. They internalize the devastating belief that their will is irrelevant, their fate immutable. This perpetual state of hypervigilance and dread quickly shattered Parvana's sleep. She began waking at 3 a.m., heart hammering, breath gasping, her nervous system firing an alarm with no conscious memory of a nightmare. Her body was now a threat to itself. The lack of sleep, a known form of torture, further degraded her cognitive and emotional resilience, making her fragile, compliant, and ready for the final step. As the wedding approached, the final fragmentation accelerated. The medical component was ostensibly clinical, but psychologically invasive. Every week, Parvana was examined by the palace physician, Dr. Mirza, a man who had treated hundreds of these pre-brides. His examination was detached, objectifying. He measured her hips, her height, her limbs, quantifying her in the way one might quantify livestock being evaluated for breeding. The internal examinations, cloaked in vague medical language, were a final, devastating violation of her physical boundary. They made absolutely clear that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state, to her future husband, and to the men who had determined its value. After these encounters, Parvana began to dissociate. She would stare at her hands, feeling disconnected from the sensation, as though a layer of glass lay between her mind and her body. Dissociation is the mind's last, ingenious survival mechanism. When the experience becomes unbearable, consciousness observes from a distance, separating from the body being violated. She survived by becoming a spectator to her own life. In the final week, the vagueness was replaced by terror. Parvana was shown objects, instruments she didn't understand, and was instructed with cold flatness. Your comfort is irrelevant. Your pleasure is irrelevant. You exist to serve. The psychological trauma became too immense to contain. She was given sedatives, opiates, to dull the edges of the panic attacks now racking her body. She moved through the final days in a functional fog, a ghost of the girl she once was. The wedding day arrived, all splendor and public celebration for a political triumph, all quiet horror for the girl beneath the silks. The ceremony was mercifully brief, a recitation of words, a contract signed by proxies. She was now the property of her husband. She was led to the bridal chamber, a room draped in obscene beauty, red silks, pristine white linens, and candles casting a warm, deceptive glow. The final instruction from the overseer was chilling. He will come. You will do as you have been taught. You will not resist. You will not speak. You will not cry. Then the door was locked. When the governor entered the room, he was drunk. He did not speak. The event was brief, transactional, completed in a haze of sedatives and dissociation. Parvana lay there, compliant, silent, her mind watching from a distance, too well trained to resist. The wedding night itself was survivable through this psychological removal. But then, in the pre-dawn hours, after the women had checked the sheets and verified the successful completion of the transaction, something snapped, the screaming that echoed through Golestan Palace that night. The sound that made guards press their backs against stone walls was not the sound of the wedding night. It was the sound of the dissociation, failing. It was the moment Parvana's mind flooded back into her traumatized body, feeling 6 months of accumulated terror, violation, and psychological annihilation all at once. It was the sound of her consciousness finally, irrevocably shattering. Parvana survived. She bore 4 children over the next 8 years. She performed her duties with exemplary, robotic obedience. She was, by all imperial metrics, a perfect success. But the woman who had loved philosophy, who had a mind sharp enough to question the stars, that girl was gone. In her place was a ghost, moving through life with compliant silence, a woman who seemed only partially present, even when looking directly at her own children. She died decades later, officially of illness. But privately, palace physicians noted she had simply seemed to give up. This is the power of invisible violence, the dark inheritance of the Qajar palace. The techniques they perfected, the isolation, the control of language, the random punishment, the enforced powerlessness, the systematic erosion of the self, are not historical curiosities. They are the same mechanisms of coercive control used by abusers in intimate relationships, refined by cults to break down recruits, and studied by authoritarian regimes to control populations. The Qajar dynasty proved that it was possible to completely destroy a person's will through purely psychological means, without leaving a single bruise. That knowledge, that terrible blueprint for control, escaped the palace. It spread. It multiplied. It became a template for silent destruction that continues to operate in the world today. We research these histories not to wallow in the past, but to recognize the patterns that are still active, to name the violence that leaves no marks, to refuse the silence that empires prefer. Thank you for listening to the Gruesome Historians. Until next time, remember, the official story is rarely the true story. The real history is often found in the silence. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments, which other hidden histories do you want us to expose?